At the very second my son handed me the eviction notice in my own living room, I handed him a $15,000 monthly rent bill for the same house, one I had legally owned since yesterday. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I simply placed the document on the polished oak coffee table between us and watched his expression fall apart, piece by piece. What happened next? Well, stay with me until the end, and tell me where you're watching from. I've learned that stories like mine travel farther than we ever expect. The house was quiet that afternoon, the kind of quiet that feels unnatural when it's shared with people who are supposed to be your family. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors I had spent decades maintaining. Every inch of that room held a memory: birthday dinners, Christmas mornings, the soft echo of my late husband's laughter still lingering in the walls. And yet, standing there in front of my own son, I felt like a stranger. Daniel didn't look at me when he handed over the envelope. His gaze stayed fixed somewhere over my shoulder, as if I were already gone. Beside him, his wife, Clara, stood with her arms crossed, her lips pressed into that thin, satisfied smile I had come to recognize over the years. She had always been subtle about it. Never openly cruel. Just small things. Comments wrapped in politeness. Decisions made without asking. Doors closed just a little too quickly when I entered the room. "Mom, it's just practical," Daniel said finally, his voice flat, rehearsed. "This place is too much for you now." Too much. I almost smiled at that. This was the same house I had managed for over 30 years. The same house I had helped build from the ground up with my husband, Robert. Back when every paycheck was carefully divided, when we chose paint colors together on a tight budget, when we planted the oak tree out front that now stretched taller than the roof. "Too much," he said, as if I were some fragile guest who had overstayed her welcome. I took the envelope from his hand and opened it slowly, more out of courtesy than curiosity. I already knew what it was. I had seen the signs for weeks, the hushed conversations, the sudden interest in paperwork, the way Clara had started referring to the house as our space instead of your home. Still, seeing it in black and white, that was something else entirely. A formal eviction notice. 30 days. I folded the paper neatly, smoothing the crease with my fingers. My hands didn't shake. That surprised me more than anything. I thought they might. Clara shifted her weight, clearly expecting something: anger, maybe. Tears. A scene she could later describe to friends as proof that I was difficult. But I gave her nothing. I simply reached into my bag, pulled out my own document, and placed it gently on the table. Daniel frowned. "What's this?" "Your rent," I said, my voice calm, almost conversational. $15,000 a month. Starting today. That's when he finally looked at me. Really looked. And for the first time since he walked into that room, I saw uncertainty flicker in his eyes. Daniel didn't reach for the paper right away. He just stared at it, then at me, like he was trying to solve a problem that no longer had a simple answer. Clara, on the other hand, stepped forward almost immediately, picking up the document with a sharp, impatient motion. I watched her eyes scan the page, her expression tightening, not with confusion, but with something closer to irritation, as if reality itself had just inconvenienced her plans. "This isn't funny," she said, her voice low and controlled. "What is this supposed to be?" I didn't respond right away. Instead, I looked around the room again, letting the silence stretch just a little longer than was comfortable. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked steadily, each second louder than the last. It reminded me of all the quiet afternoons I had spent here alone over the past few months, noticing things I used to overlook, like how often Daniel and Clara whispered in the kitchen, or how quickly conversations stopped when I walked in. "It's a lease agreement," I said finally, meeting her eyes. "And a payment schedule. Very standard." Daniel let out a short, disbelieving laugh, running a hand through his hair. "Mom, you don't own this house. Dad left it to me. We went over this. Did we?" I tilted my head slightly, studying him. For a moment, I didn't see the man standing in front of me. I saw the boy who used to sit at this very table doing his homework, the one who would look up at me with complete trust, asking if I thought he'd done a good job. Back then, he never doubted my word. Back then, he never needed proof. That's what you were told, I said gently. Clara's eyes snapped back to me. Excuse me? I reached for my bag again, pulling out a second folder, thicker this time, neatly organized, every page tabbed and labeled. I had spent the better part of yesterday morning sitting across from a lawyer, going through each document line by line, making sure there were no misunderstandings. I had learned something important in that office: assumptions can be very expensive. I went to the bank yesterday, I continued, my tone steady. And then I met with Robert's attorney. There were updates made to the property before he passed. Legal ones. Daniel's face paled slightly. What kind of updates? The kind that transfer full ownership, I said. To me. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Clara shook her head immediately, a quick, dismissive movement. That's not possible. We would have known. We've been handling all the paperwork since the funeral. I finished for her. She stopped. And there it was, that small crack. I folded my hands in my lap, keeping my posture relaxed, even as I felt something shift deep inside me. Not anger. Not even satisfaction. Just clarity. The kind that comes when you finally stop questioning your own instincts. For the past 6 weeks, I said, I've watched you both make decisions about my life without ever asking me a single question. You changed the locks on the storage room. You moved my things out of the downstairs bedroom. You even scheduled a realtor to come by next Tuesday. I paused, letting that sink in. Did you really think I wouldn't notice? Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again. His eyes flickered toward Clara, searching for something, guidance, maybe. But she didn't look at him. She was too busy staring at the papers in her hand, flipping through them faster now. Her composure slipping just enough to be visible. This doesn't change anything, she said finally, though her voice had lost some of its edge. Even if this were true, you can't just expect us to what? I asked quietly. She didn't answer. I leaned back slightly in my chair, feeling the weight of the moment settle. For years, I had made myself smaller to keep the peace. I had ignored the signs, dismissed the discomfort, convinced myself that love meant patience, even when that patience was being used against me. But sitting there now, watching them struggle to understand how the ground had shifted beneath their feet, I realized something I should have understood a long time ago. They hadn't just been preparing to take my home. They had been counting on me to let them. Daniel finally sank into the armchair across from me, the same one his father used to sit in every evening with a newspaper folded neatly in his lap. But there was no calm about him now. His knee bounced slightly, his fingers tapping against the armrest in a rhythm that betrayed everything he wasn't saying out loud. Clara remained standing, still flipping through the documents, though I could tell she had already reached the part that mattered. The rest was just her trying to find a way out. This had to be done recently, she said, her voice tightening. You said yesterday. This doesn't just happen overnight. She wasn't wrong. I let out a slow breath, folding my hands together again, resting them lightly against my purse. No, I said. It doesn't. The paperwork was prepared months ago. Robert just never told anyone except his attorney. Daniel looked up sharply at the mention of his father's name. For a brief second, something flickered across his face, hurt, maybe. Or guilt. It was hard to tell anymore. Why wouldn't he tell me, he asked, his voice quieter now, less certain. That question lingered between us, heavier than anything that had been said so far. I held his gaze for a moment, searching for the right answer. Not the kind that would comfort him, but the kind that was true. Because he saw things, I said simply. Clara scoffed under her breath. That's vague. It's accurate. The room fell silent again, but this time it felt different. Not tense in the same way, more like something had shifted underneath the surface, something none of us could ignore anymore. Your father noticed how things were changing, I continued. Not all at once. Little things. The way conversations started happening without me. The way decisions were made, and then presented as if I had already agreed. The way this house slowly stopped feeling like mine, even before he was gone. Daniel's eyes dropped to the floor. And he didn't like that, I added. Clara crossed her arms tighter, defensive now. So what, he just decided to cut his own son out? That doesn't make any sense. I shook my head. He didn't cut you out, Daniel. He made sure I wouldn't be. That distinction landed harder than I expected. I could see it in the way Daniel's shoulders slumped slightly, the way his posture softened, not in surrender, but in realization. He wasn't being punished. He was just no longer being protected from the consequences of his own choices. For 32 years, I said, my voice steady, your father and I built this life together. Every payment, every repair, every sacrifice, it was ours. Not his. Not mine. Ours. I paused, letting that settle. And before he passed, he made a decision about what would happen to that life after he was gone. Clara opened her mouth again, but this time, Daniel raised his hands slightly, stopping her. It wasn't dramatic. Just a small gesture. But it was the first time since they walked in that he hadn't immediately followed her lead. Let her finish, he said quietly. I noticed that. And I filed it away. He didn't trust what would happen if everything was handed over without question, I continued. So he set up a transfer. Legal, documented, irreversible. The house was placed under my name, effective immediately upon his passing. I met Daniel's eyes again. Which means, legally, you were never in a position to evict me. Clara let out a short, sharp laugh, but it sounded forced now. Okay, even if that's true, this is still ridiculous. You're seriously going to charge your own son rent? $15,000? That's insane. I didn't react to her tone. I had heard variations of it before, dismissal, disbelief, the quiet assumption that I would back down if pushed hard enough. I didn't set that number randomly, I said. It's based on the current market rate for homes in this area. You can verify it yourself. Daniel rubbed his face with both hands, exhaling slowly. This is too much, Mom. Too much. The same words he had used earlier. I leaned forward slightly, my voice calm but firm. You handed me a legal document asking me to leave my own home in 30 days. You didn't sit me down. You didn't ask what I wanted. You decided what was the best for me and expected me to accept it. I paused. And now you're telling me this is too much? Neither of them answered. The clock ticked on. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was waiting for their approval. Daniel didn't say anything after that. He just sat there, elbows on his knees now, staring down at the eviction notice he had brought with him, as if it no longer made sense in his hands. Clara, however, wasn't finished. She never was. I could almost predict the moment she would speak again, the way her jaw tightened just slightly before the words came out. So what now? She said, her tone sharper again, though I could hear the strain underneath it. You expect us to just, what? Pay you to live here? In our own home? I let that word hang in the air for a second. Our. It was interesting how easily that had become her language. Not Daniel's home. Not your father's home. Just, ours. As if years of quiet repetition had turned assumption into fact. I stood up slowly, not in a rush, not to intimidate, just because I had spent enough time sitting in that chair feeling like I needed permission to exist in my own space. My hand brushed lightly against the back of the sofa as I walked past them, my fingers tracing the fabric absent-mindedly. I remembered picking it out with Robert 15 years ago. He had insisted on the darker color, said it would hide stains better when Daniel inevitably spilled something during the holidays. I expect clarity, I said as I stopped near the window, looking out at the front yard. The oak tree swayed gently in the afternoon breeze, its branches casting familiar shadows across the lawn. Something we haven't had in this house for a long time. Behind me, I could hear Clara shifting, the faint sound of paper being set down on the table. Daniel still hadn't moved. For weeks, I continued, I kept asking myself if I was imagining things. If maybe I was just getting older. Forgetting conversations. Misunderstanding tone. I let out a quiet breath. That's what happens, you know. When people start treating you like you're already on your way out, you begin to question your own place before they ever have to say it out loud. No one interrupted me. So I kept going. I remember the day you changed the locks on the storage room, I said, turning slightly so I could see them both. You told me it was for security. That packages had gone missing in the neighborhood. I looked at Clara. But somehow, I was the only one who didn't get a new key. Clara opened her mouth, but I didn't stop. And then there was the downstairs bedroom, I added. The one I moved into after Robert passed, because it felt smaller. Easier to manage. I came home one afternoon and found half my things boxed up. You said you were reorganizing. Making better use of the space. I paused. You never asked if I was still using it. Daniel flinched at that. Just a little. But I saw it. And the realtor, I said softly. Next Tuesday at 10 in the morning. You scheduled a walkthrough. You thought I didn't hear the call. The silence that followed was different now. Heavier. Not defensive. Not confused. Exposed. Clara crossed her arms again, but this time it felt less like confidence and more like a shield. We were trying to help, she said. You can't seriously expect to maintain a property like this on your own. It's not realistic. I nodded slowly, as if considering her words. I agree, I said. That seemed to catch her off guard. This house isn't easy to maintain, I continued. It never was. That's why your father and I worked together. That's why we planned ahead. That's why we made sure everything was taken care of, legally, financially, practically. I stepped closer to the table again, resting my hand lightly on the edge, grounding myself in something solid. What's not realistic, I added quietly, is expecting me to step aside without question while you make decisions about my life behind closed doors. Daniel finally looked up again. Mom, he started, but his voice trailed off, like he didn't quite know how to finish the sentence anymore. I held his gaze, not with anger, not with accusation, but with something steadier than both. For years, I said, I thought if I stayed quiet, if I didn't make things difficult, if I just adjusted, everything would settle. That we would find our way back to being a family. I shook my head slightly. But silence doesn't fix anything. It just makes it easier for other people to decide things for you. The clock ticked again in the corner. And this time, no one tried to fill the space between the seconds. Daniel's voice lingered in the air after he said, Mom, but nothing came after it. No explanation. No apology. Just that one word, like he was hoping it would still mean something, like it could undo everything that had already been set in motion. I studied his face for a moment, searching for the boy I used to know, the one who would run to me after school and tell me everything without hesitation. But that version of him felt far away now, buried under years of quiet distance and someone else's influence. You don't have to finish that sentence, I said gently. I already know how it ends. Clara shifted again, clearly uncomfortable with the direction this was going. This is getting dramatic, she said, brushing invisible lint off her sleeve. We're talking about a house, not, no, I interrupted softly, turning my head just enough to look at her. We're not. That stopped her. This was never just about the house, I continued. If it were, you would have talked to me. You would have asked what I wanted. You would have given me time. I paused, letting the weight of that settle. Instead, you made a plan. Quietly. carefully. And you expected me to simply disappear into it. Daniel swallowed hard, his eyes flickering between me and the documents on the table. We thought it would be easier this way, he said, almost defensively. Less stress for you. Easier for who? I asked. He didn't answer. I nodded slightly, more to myself than to him. You see, that's the part that changed everything for me, I said. Not the paperwork. Not even the eviction notice. I glanced down at the folded documents still resting on the table. It was realizing that somewhere along the way, I stopped being part of the conversation entirely. The room felt smaller now, like the walls had inched closer without anyone noticing. I spent years making sure this family stayed together, I went on. Holidays, birthdays, dinners, you name it. I remembered everything. I adjusted to everyone. I made space, over and over again. I looked at Daniel. And I never once asked for anything in return except respect. Clara let out a quiet sigh, like she was tired of hearing it. We do respect you. I met her eyes calmly. No, I said. You tolerated me. That landed. Silence followed, but it wasn't empty. It was full, of everything that had been avoided for too long. I reached for the lease agreement again, sliding it slightly closer to them across the table. The paper made a soft, deliberate sound against the wood. I'm not asking you to leave today, I said. I'm not even asking you to agree with me. I paused. But if you choose to stay in this house, it won't be under assumptions anymore. Daniel looked down at the document again, his jaw tightening. There will be terms, I added quietly. Clear ones. And for the first time since this conversation began, neither of them tried to argue back. Clara was the first to break the silence, but this time her voice didn't carry the same certainty it had before. Terms, she repeated, like the word itself offended her. This isn't a business arrangement. This is family. I let out a quiet breath at that. That word, family, had been used so many times in this house, but rarely when it actually mattered. Then we should have acted like one, I said calmly. Daniel shifted in his seat again, leaning forward, elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped together tightly now. He looked tired. Not angry. Not defensive. Just tired. Like something inside him was finally catching up to everything that had been said. What kind of terms? He asked, his voice lower than before. I nodded slightly, acknowledging the question. Not because he was challenging me, but because, for the first time, he was actually listening. Simple ones, I said. Respect. Communication. And clarity. Clara let out a small, almost incredulous laugh. That's vague. No, I replied, meeting her eyes. It's not. You just haven't had to define it before. I reached for the folder again, opening it slowly, turning it toward them so they could both see. Everything was there, dates, signatures, conditions. Nothing emotional. Nothing personal. Just facts. If you stay here, I continued, you contribute. Not just financially, though yes, the rent stands, but in how this home is treated. No decisions about this property happen without me. No changes, no listings, no plans discussed behind closed doors. I paused briefly. And no more assuming I'll just go along with whatever you decide. Daniel nodded faintly, almost instinctively, like that part made sense to him even if the rest didn't fully settle yet. Clara, on the other hand, crossed her arms again. And if we don't agree? I held her gaze, steady and unshaken. Then you have the same option you gave me. That landed harder than anything else I'd said. For a moment, no one moved. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street, tires rolling over the pavement in a low, steady hum. It was such an ordinary sound, but inside that room, everything felt different now, like the ground had shifted and finally settled into something real. Daniel leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose, his eyes drifting toward the window for a second before returning to me. I didn't think it would go this way, he said quietly. I believed him. But that didn't change anything. Neither did I replied. There was no bitterness in my voice. Just truth. Clara picked up the lease again, her fingers tightening around the edges of the paper. 15,000 a month, she muttered, more to herself than to us. That's ridiculous. It's accurate, I said. She looked up sharply. You're serious about this? Yes, I answered. No hesitation. No softening. Because this wasn't about the number. It was about something far more expensive than money. Daniel looked between us again, then down at the table, his jaw tightening as if he were finally understanding the position they were in. Not the one they had planned. The one they had created. And for the first time since this began, they weren't the ones in control anymore. Daniel leaned forward again, this time slower, like every movement required more thought than before. He picked up the lease with both hands, reading it more carefully now, not skimming, not dismissing. Actually reading. I watched his eyes move across the lines, the legal language, the numbers, the signatures. And I could see the moment it settled in. Not just what the paper said, but what it meant. Clara didn't sit down. She stayed where she was, arms crossed, but her posture had changed. Less rigid. Less certain. The confidence she walked in with had started to crack, replaced by something sharper, calculation. There has to be another way, Daniel said finally, his voice quieter, almost cautious. We don't have to formalize everything like this. I tilted my head slightly. We already did, I said. He looked up at me, and for a second, there was something almost pleading in his expression. Not for the house. Not even for the money. But for things to go back to how they were, before this moment forced everything into the open. But that wasn't possible anymore. You handed me a legal notice, I continued. You made this formal the second you decided I needed to leave. Clara exhaled sharply, stepping closer to the table. That was different, she said. That was about helping you move into something more manageable. This is punishment. I shook my head once. No, I said. This is structure. She didn't like that answer. I could tell. Daniel placed the lease back down slowly, his fingers lingering on the edge of the paper. 15,000 is a lot, he said. Even for this area. It is, I agreed. That caught him off guard. But it's also what this house is worth, I added. And if we're going to treat it like an asset instead of a home, then we treat it properly. The words settled heavily between us. Clara looked at him immediately. Daniel, she said under her breath, like she didn't want me to hear, but of course I did. We can't agree to this. He didn't respond right away. And that silence said more than anything else. I watched him closely. The way his shoulders had lowered. The way his eyes no longer avoided mine. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't just reacting, he was thinking. I need a minute, he said finally, standing up. Clara turned to him sharply. A minute for what? He didn't answer her. Instead, he walked past me toward the window, the same one I had stood by earlier. He looked out at the yard, at the oak tree, at the driveway where he used to ride his bike in circles when he was 8 years old. I wondered if he was seeing those same memories now, or if he was just trying to escape the weight of the room. You remember when we planted that tree? I said quietly. He didn't turn around, but I saw his head nod slightly. You said it would take forever to grow, I added. You didn't think it would ever get taller than the house. A faint, almost invisible smile touched his face for just a second. And then it was gone. Clara shifted impatiently behind him. This isn't about a tree, she said. No, I replied softly. It's not. Daniel finally turned back around, his expression different now. Not soft. Not defensive. Just clear. If we stay, he said slowly, we follow the terms. Clara stared at him like she hadn't heard him correctly. Excuse me? He didn't look at her. His eyes stayed on me. We follow the terms, he repeated. And just like that, the balance in the room changed again. Clara's reaction was immediate. No, she said, sharp and firm, like she could still override the moment if she pushed hard enough. No, we are not doing that. Daniel, you don't just agree to something like this without what? He cut in, his voice not loud, but steady in a way I hadn't heard in years. She stopped. Daniel turned to her fully now, and I watched something shift in him, not anger, not even frustration. Just distance. The kind that comes when someone starts seeing things clearly for the first time. Without talking it through, she said, recovering quickly. Without thinking about what this actually means. This is our home. He held her gaze for a second, then shook his head slowly. It's not, he said. That landed harder than anything else so far. Clara blinked, like she hadn't expected resistance from him. Excuse me? It's not ours, Daniel repeated, quieter this time, but more certain. It never was. The room went still again, but this silence felt different. Not tense. Not uncertain. Just real. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. Clara let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh, but there was no humor in it. So that's it, she said. You're just going to accept this? After everything we've put into this place? Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. What exactly have we put into it? He asked. She opened her mouth, then hesitated. Just for a second. And that was enough. You redecorated the kitchen, he continued. You changed the curtains. You talked about remodeling the upstairs. He paused. But none of that was ever ours to begin with. Clara's expression hardened, her patience slipping. So now you're taking her side? There it was. Sides. As if this had ever been about choosing one over the other. Daniel exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. I'm not taking sides, he said. I'm just acknowledging what's actually true. I watched him carefully. This wasn't the same man who walked in with that envelope earlier. Something had shifted. Not all at once. But enough. Clara turned away from him, pacing a few steps across the room, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. This is unbelievable, she muttered. After everything we've done, after everything we planned, she stopped. Too late. The words had already slipped out. Daniel looked up at her immediately. Planned, he repeated. She froze, just for a moment, then shook her head quickly. I didn't mean, yes, you did, he said. The air in the room tightened again, but this time it wasn't directed at me. It was between them. I stayed where I was, silent, watching the truth unfold without needing to force it. That was the thing about silence, it gives people space to reveal themselves. What did you plan, Clara? Daniel asked, his voice still calm, but firmer now. She crossed her arms again, defensive, her eyes flicking briefly toward me before returning to him. We talked about options, she said. That's all. Future plans. That's normal. Selling the house, he asked. She didn't answer. Moving her out, he pressed. Still nothing. Daniel let out a slow breath, his shoulders rising and falling as the realization settled deeper. You already had this figured out, he said. Clara's silence was answer enough. And in that moment, he finally understood what I had seen all along. Daniel didn't speak right away after that. He just stood there, looking at Clara like he was seeing her from a distance he hadn't noticed before. Not as his partner standing beside him, but as someone who had been moving pieces on a board he hadn't fully understood. The room felt tighter, like the air itself had thickened with everything that had just been uncovered. You were going to sell it, he said finally, not as a question this time, but as a quiet statement. Clara's lips pressed together, her silence stretching just a second too long. Then she exhaled, like she was done pretending. "We talked about it," she said. "Yes. Eventually. That was always the plan. Always." That word landed harder than anything else. Daniel blinked slowly. "Always," he repeated. She nodded, her tone steadier now, like she had decided to lean into it instead of backing away. "It makes sense, Daniel. This house is worth a fortune. Sitting on it like this, it's not practical. We could have sold it, downsized, invested the rest. Built something smarter." I watched him carefully. Not interrupting. Not stepping in. Because this part, he needed to hear from her. "And Mom?" he asked, his voice lower now. Clara hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. "We would have found her something comfortable," she said. "A smaller place. Maybe a community where she'd have people her own age. It would have been better for her." Better for her. I had heard that phrase before. Daniel let out a short breath, almost like a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it. "You mean easier for us," he said. Clara's eyes sharpened. "For everyone," she corrected. "No," he said, shaking his head. "For you." That was the first time his voice carried something close to firmness. Not loud. Not aggressive. Just certain. Clara took a step back, clearly not expecting that shift. "Why are you making this sound like something bad?" she asked. "We were planning ahead. That's what people do." Daniel didn't answer her right away. Instead, he turned slightly, his eyes drifting toward the table again, toward the eviction notice he had brought into this house like it was just another document. Then he looked at me. "I didn't know it was already happening," he said. There it was. Not denial. Not excuses. Just the truth. I nodded once. "I know," I said. And I did. That didn't make it harmless. But it made it clear. Clara crossed her arms again, her patience wearing thin. "So what now?" she said. "We made a plan. Maybe it wasn't perfect, but it was practical. You can't seriously expect us to just throw everything out because of this." She gestured vaguely toward the papers. Toward me. Toward the reality she didn't like. I didn't move. I didn't raise my voice. "I don't expect anything," I said calmly. "You already made your expectations clear." Daniel looked between us again, the weight of it all finally settling on his shoulders in a way that couldn't be ignored anymore. The eviction notice. The lease. The truth. It was all sitting there on that table. And for the first time, he had to decide which version of this story he was going to stand in. Daniel didn't answer right away. He stood there, staring at the table like all the answers might be written somewhere between the eviction notice and the lease agreement. His hand hovered slightly above the papers, then dropped back to his side. I could see it now, the weight of it all settling in. Not just the situation, but his role in it. Clara didn't wait. "We're not doing this," she said, her voice sharper now, the patience completely gone. "This is ridiculous. We're talking about your mother trying to charge you rent for a house that was supposed to be yours. This isn't normal, Daniel." He didn't look at her. "That's the problem," he said quietly. "None of this is normal." She scoffed, shaking her head. "Oh, please. What's not normal is this," she gestured toward me again, her hand cutting through the air, "this power move. This is manipulation." I almost smiled at that. Not because it was funny. But because it was familiar. "Is it?" I asked softly. Clara turned to me immediately. "Yes, it is. You waited until the last second to pull this out. You could have said something earlier." "I did," I said. That stopped her for a second. "I asked questions," I continued. "I tried to be included. I tried to understand what was happening in my own home. I paused. You just didn't think it mattered. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, like that landed somewhere deeper than he expected. Clara shook her head again, refusing to give ground. That's not the same thing. You never said anything about owning the house. No, I agreed. I didn't. And that was the truth. Because I hadn't known for certain until yesterday. But I had known something wasn't right. Daniel finally moved, pulling out the chair beside him and sitting down slowly, like his legs didn't quite trust him anymore. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees again, his hands clasped tightly, his gaze fixed on the floor. This got out of hand, he muttered. Clara turned toward him sharply. No, it didn't. It got complicated because she made it complicated. He shook his head. No, he said again, this time a little firmer. It got complicated because we didn't handle it right. That hung in the air. Clara stared at him, disbelief written all over her face. So now it's our fault? Daniel looked up at her finally. Yes, he said. No hesitation. No softness. Just truth. The room went still. Even the clock in the corner seemed quieter now, like it understood something had shifted. Clara let out a breath, slow and controlled, but I could see it in her eyes. This wasn't the direction she expected things to go. Not at all. So what are you saying? She asked, her voice lower now. That we just accept this? That we pay her $15,000 a month and pretend everything's fine? Daniel didn't answer. Immediately. He looked at me instead. And this time, there was no avoidance in his eyes. Just something honest. No, he said slowly. I'm saying we fix what we did wrong first. That was new. I held his gaze, not interrupting, not pushing, just letting him speak. He took a breath, then another, like he was choosing each word carefully now. We came in here with a decision already made, he continued. We didn't ask. We didn't listen. We just assumed. Clara crossed her arms again, but she didn't interrupt this time. We assumed she'd go along with it, he added quietly. And there it was. Everything, stripped down to its simplest form. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. Because for the first time since this all began, he said it for me. Daniel's words didn't fade away this time. They stayed in the room, settling into the walls, into the silence, into everything that had been avoided for far too long. We assumed she'd go along with it. I let that sit exactly where it belonged, between us, undeniable and finally spoken out loud. Clara let out a slow breath, her posture tightening again, but there was something different now. Less control. Less certainty. So what does that even mean? She asked, her voice lower, more measured. Fix it how? Daniel didn't answer immediately. He leaned back slightly in his chair, his eyes drifting for a moment, not away from the situation, but deeper into it, like he was replaying everything that had led up to this point. When he spoke again, his voice wasn't defensive anymore. It was steady. It means we stop acting like this is ours to decide alone, he said. Clara's lips pressed into a thin line. Daniel, no, he cut in, not harshly, but firmly enough to stop her. We don't get to walk in here, hand her papers, and expect her to just accept it. That silence came back again. But this time, it didn't feel uncomfortable. It felt necessary. He turned to me then, and there was something in his expression I hadn't seen in a long time. Not guilt. Not even regret. Just recognition. I should have talked to you, he said. Simple. Clear. Late, but real. I didn't rush to respond. I didn't soften it, didn't immediately forgive it. Didn't turn it into something lighter than it was. I just nodded once. Yes, I said quietly. Because that was the truth. Clara shifted her weight, clearly unsettled now. So that's it, she asked. You just say sorry, and suddenly this whole situation flips? That's not how this works. Daniel didn't look at her. It's not about flipping anything, he said. It's about acknowledging what we did. And then what? She pressed. He finally turned to her, his expression calm but unyielding. Then we deal with the consequences. That landed harder than anything else he'd said so far. Clara stared at him, searching for hesitation, for something she could push against, something she could still control. But there wasn't anything there anymore. I watched them both, quietly, taking it in. For years, I had tried to hold things together, to smooth over tension before it ever became visible. But now, I understood something differently. Sometimes things need to break, so you can finally see what they were made of. I'm not trying to take anything from you, I said, my voice steady, cutting gently through the moment. I'm setting boundaries. Something I should have done a long time ago. Daniel nodded faintly, like that made sense to him now in a way it hadn't before. Clara didn't respond. Not right away. Instead, she looked down at the table again, the lease, the notice, the reality sitting right in front of her, and for the first time since she walked into this house, she didn't have a quick answer. No argument. No clever turn of words. Just silence. And in that silence, everything finally felt honest. Daniel didn't speak again for a long time after that. None of us did. The room settled into a quiet that felt different from before, not tense, not fragile, just honest. The kind of quiet that comes when there's nothing left to hide. Clara was the first to move, but even that felt slower now. She picked up her purse from the chair, her movements more deliberate, like she was carefully deciding what to do next instead of reacting out of habit. She glanced at Daniel, waiting, just for a second, for him to follow her lead the way he always had. But he didn't. I think we should go, she said finally, her voice controlled, though softer than before. Daniel nodded, but he didn't stand immediately. His eyes lingered on the table one last time, the eviction notice, still folded, now meaningless, and the lease, untouched but understood. Then he looked at me. Can we talk later? He asked. Not demand. Not assumption. Just a question. I met his gaze and gave a small nod. When you're ready, I said. That was enough. He stood, slower than when he had walked in, like something in him had shifted its weight. Clara turned toward the door without another word, but this time, Daniel didn't walk ahead of me, didn't avoid my eyes. He paused. Mom, he said again. But this time, it didn't sound like a placeholder for something unfinished. It sounded like it meant something again. I didn't answer right away. I just looked at him, really looked at him, the man he had become, the choices he had made, and the moment he was standing in now. Then I gave him a quiet smile. Not big. Not dramatic. Just enough. And he nodded, like he understood. They left together, the front door closing with a soft, final click behind them. And just like that, the house was mine again. Not just on paper. But in feeling. I stood there for a moment, listening to the silence settle back into place. The same sunlight still stretched across the floor, the same shadows moved gently with the breeze outside. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. I walked slowly into the living room, my fingers brushing the edge of the table where everything had unfolded. The lease was still there. I picked it up, looked at it for a second, then folded it carefully and set it aside. Not as a weapon. Not as a threat. Just as a boundary. Then I turned toward the window again, my eyes resting on the oak tree outside. The one Daniel and Robert had planted all those years ago. It had grown strong over time, quietly, steadily, through storms, through seasons, without asking for permission. I realized something then. Strength doesn't always look loud. Sometimes, it looks like patience. Sometimes, it looks like silence. And sometimes, it looks like finally saying no. I didn't know what would happen next. Whether Daniel would come back ready to rebuild something honest, or whether distance would grow where closeness used to be. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of that answer. Because I wasn't waiting to be chosen anymore. I had already chosen myself. And that changed everything.